Is that a good enough sign? Oh. Okay, all right. Good morning. Again, I'll be masked up this time, as we all know. Gosh, guys, it's spreading hard and fast. So just that extra layer of precaution so that you have a trust and I have a trust, okay? Even though we are distance apart, it's still, I think that one extra thing is important. Anyway, let's begin with prayer. Gracious Lord, you have told us so much through your parables these last few weeks. And Lord, when you were talking so intimately with the disciples and just the disciples, I just know there are things that you wanted them to know about where you came from and how it was they needed to think about going there. Amen. Okay, well, let's start with last week. By the way, can everybody hear me? Are we okay? If I keep my voice up, oh boy. All right. Do you remember the parable we did last week of the rich man and Lazarus and what you remember about it and some of the things that we talked about? Remember, the rich man was never named except for the rich man, but Lazarus was. And there are just so many different ways people have gone with this parable. But remember the key points. Jesus talked about a very, very clear chasm between where Lazarus was with Abraham and where the rich man was. And remember the attitude of the rich man. He still wanted Lazarus to serve him. And when that couldn't happen, because Abraham told him no, not once, but twice. It was like, you're not in charge anymore. And when the rich man finally got it, he asked, can my brothers, can we go back and say something to my brothers? And Abraham goes, no. This is it. There's no going back. This is a real place. Where Lazarus is in Abraham, it's a real place. And where you are, it's a real place. And there's no mixing anymore. The kingdom of heaven is like. Well, today, what I'd like to do, keep going if you would please, Dodie. We're going to talk a little bit about tradition. We're going to talk about, and I think it's so interesting that what Bob's lectionary and what he talked on this morning is the exact same parable I'm speaking on today, and we did not get together for this. I determined a long time ago this is a parable that I wanted to talk about for this week. I had no idea what the lectionary was going to be. So to tell you the truth, I called Bob and said, we're meeting here. Is this going to be okay? And he says, it's fine, which I love the attitude because not every pastor would have said that. So I made sure that I was here to hear his side of the story. And now you get to hear my side of the story. And who's right? Well, he is, of course. He's the pastor. I'm going to come at it just a little bit differently, but the background was wonderful that he did this morning. Absolutely wonderful. He's going to do more end times. I'm going to talk about a little bit more about the tradition of the Jews. We don't understand tradition like the Jews did. It was a generational tradition passed on from generation to generation to generation to generation. And woe to a generation, a family, that screwed it up. Because that would have been remembered for generations. Oh, do you remember when great-grandfather what's-his-face did this? They were so steeped in tradition. You did this at this time, you did this at this time, you observed these festivals. I mean, everything. It was like a scripted life. And the best I can do is the following video that talks a little bit about tradition. So here we go. See if you recognize it, okay? And the reason I do this is because this parable, every last one of the people that Jesus was speaking to, his disciples, his followers, would have known exactly what he was talking about. Maybe not the allegorical or the anecdotal or symbolism that people put into this, but they would have known about the bridesmaids and how wedding was done in Jewish culture, and about any place along the way where embarrassment could have come. So let me set the stage a little bit. Just prior to this, and we're in the last days of Jesus' ministry. In fact, this is one of the very last stories, along with a couple of others, that we've done, the parable of the talents and the sheep and the goats. But prior to this, he'd been teaching in the temple, and this comes from the previous chapter. He had been teaching in the temple, and he starts to walk away to the Mount of Olives, and he catches the disciples gaping at the temple. Isn't this beautiful? And he talks to them about, you see this? Here's what's going to happen. So they ask the question, what's going to happen in the end times? How do we know when you come back? That's the question. And so now Jesus is going into it. And he talks all about the signs that Bob does such a great job with today. But he starts to tell this parable in particular, and it starts, as so many of them do, the kingdom of heaven is like. In other words, let's talk about this, fellas. The kingdom of heaven is like, because he just keeps going over it and over it and over it. He doesn't say the kingdom of heaven is, it's always is like. Because I think he knows their understanding, just it's not there. Go to Revelation when John talks about what he sees. It is phenomenal. It is fantastic. So Jesus constantly does, the kingdom of heaven is like. So that's where we pick it up, okay? It's the final teaching along with the parable of the talents and the parable of the sheep and goats, which we've already gone through. The kingdom of heaven is like. So he's taking them right through. Let's keep going. So here's where we are. He's in his final teachings. It indicates that he's talking to his disciples only on the Mount of Olives. He's gone from the temple to the Mount of Olives just before, a couple of days before, all the events take place for the crucifixion, okay? The trial or lack thereof, and the scourging, and you guys know that. Let's keep going. So here we go. Then the kingdom of heaven will be like, and again, I'm in the Amplified Bible. Goes into a little more detail. 10 virgins, 10 bridesmaids, whatever that you want to talk about, they would have instantly known. Tradition. They would have instantly known what Jesus was talking about, who took their lamps and went to meet the bridegroom. Oh yeah, we know this. This is how it's supposed to be. Every wedding takes place like this. And the wedding feast that he talks about would have taken place in the bridegroom's father's house, I believe. Okay? And everything was scripted. This is how it works. They went to meet the bridegroom. 5 of them were foolish, thoughtless, silly, and careless. And 5 were wise, farsighted, practical, and sensible. That's why I use the Amplified Bible, if for nothing else than for right here. Let's keep going. For when the foolish took their lamps, they did not take any extra oil with them. But the wise took flasks of oil along with their lamps. And I guess, just reading about it, this is so far out of my wheelhouse and yours and mine, because we didn't live like this. But they would have known. I guess a lamp would have contained about an hour's worth of oil. And, you had to constantly feed it to make sure that it would have given off light, okay? But the wise took flasks of oil along with their lamps. Okay, makes sense. Everybody would have known. Keep going, please. Now, while the bridegroom was delayed, which is just rich with symbolism, I think. Because when we understand, Jesus is talking about himself here. He's delayed in his second coming, if this is what where we're going to go. They began to nod off and they fell asleep. Notice, the 5 wise and the 5 foolish all fell asleep. Every last one of them. It's sort of like when Jesus went into the Garden of Gethsemane to pray and he asked some of the disciples to come with him. And he asked them specifically to stay awake, and they could not. But at midnight, there was a shout. Midnight, dark. Look, the bridegroom is coming. Go out to meet him. Keep going. Then all those virgins got up, everybody, all 10 of them, and put their own lamps in order, trimmed the wicks, added oil, and lit them. And many of us have no idea what it means to trim a wick. Okay? Why would you need to trim a wick? What's going on there? They didn't have matches. They didn't have lighters. How would they have done that? Okay? But the foolish virgin said to the wise, give us some of your oil because our lamps are going out. But the wise replied, and this is interesting, no. Remember back to Abraham. When the rich man asked Abraham twice, and the words were no. And this is the same kind of no. No. And then there's an exclamation. Otherwise, there will be not enough for us and for you too. Go instead to the dealers and buy oil for yourselves. This is midnight. Who's still in business at that time? Right? It's midnight. So they get told no. Okay. What happens now? Let's keep going. But while they were going away to buy oil, the bridegroom came. And those who were ready went in with him to the wedding feast, and the door was shut and locked. This would have been interesting. I have to imagine, I'm just imagining now that the disciples and his followers, whoever that is, are listening and going, that's odd. Why would they shut and lock the door? But okay, your parable, Jesus. Here we go, let's keep going. Later, the others also came and said, Lord, Lord, open the door for us. Makes sense, because remember about tradition, it would have been a huge embarrassment for everybody involved that the people who had been invited, which would have probably been the entire village, and the expectations of the entire village, that the father of the bridegroom would have done everything correctly, traditionally. He invited 10 bridegrooms or bridesmaids, there better be 10 there. Otherwise, he'd been talked about for generations. Where are they? But notice how Jesus does this parable. Lord, Lord, open the door for us. But he replied, I assure you, and I think these are some of the hardest words to hear for all of us, and most solemnly say to you, I don't know you. We have no relationship. I don't know you. And for the disciples listening, if they didn't know what Jesus was referring to except the wedding feast, that would have been tough because of tradition. They would have wanted those other 5 bridesmaids there. But they were late. And why were they late? Didn't have any oil. What's going on? I don't know you. We have no relationship. Keep going. And I love it when Jesus just gives us a nibble, a hint, a breadcrumb, so to speak. Therefore, be on alert. Be prepared and ready, for you don't know the day nor the hour when the Son of Man will come. And he's telling them, be on alert, for you don't know when I will be coming back again. In fact, he talks, when he's in telling things in other places, he says, nobody knows the time, not even me. But I want you to be alert. And I want you to go back to the passage. Dodie, you don't have to do it. But I want you to go back to where it said, all of them were sleeping. I think that is very telling. Jesus knew that everybody would be sleeping. For me, it's more about who's prepared, even when you're sleeping. In other words, what does it take to be prepared? In this, he indicates the oil. What's that all about? Fascinating. Well, to give you a little more flavor of the day, I've asked Dodie to show another video. Like all of them, I have to give you some qualification for it. It's put out by the Church of Latter-day Saints, the Mormons. And some people have a really hard time with Mormons. In fact, some people will even go to the point of saying, well, they're not one of us. And you say, Gary, what do you mean? They're not one of us. Some people will tell you, oh, they're not Christian. Because they do things differently. I'm not negating that. I'm not saying, forget about that. I'm not here to do that. But here's what I do know. That when my parents, my elderly parents, my dad's 90 now, my mother's 86, had terrific health problems 2.5 years ago. I have 6 brothers and sisters. They were desperate for help. I had finally gotten my brothers and sisters to understand how desperate they were for help, even though they didn't want it. Not one of us, myself included, was willing to go in, take apart their lives and go in and help them out except for, extraneous things. My sister, who is Mormon, and her husband dropped everything to come to live with my parents. I don't care what you think about it. Here's what I know. They did something even I was unwilling to do. So I have a deep level of respect for that because not of what they've said, but because of what they did. So here we go, and I'm going to warn you, the very last verse on here, the very last verse comes from a book in the Mormon religion, I don't know how else to put it, that we will have never seen before. But I want you to think about it. I'm not asking you to take it as true. I'm asking you to think about it. Okay? All right, let's see this. wrestled and I wrestled and I wrestled whether I should show that to you. But in the end, there were some things in there I just wanted you to think about. Did you catch that last singing? I say to you, those of you that had, those of you that did not. I think one of the most ominous sounds in the world. In fact, they did a study on what are the most scariest sounds ever heard. They did the top 10 scariest sounds. You know what number 1 is? It's the rack of a 12-gauge shotgun. Scariest sound, because everybody knows what that means. But to me, I think one of the scariest sounds ever is that door being shut, never to be opened again. So here's my question to you that I'd like you to talk about and discuss with your person, if that's okay. I'd like you to talk about what's the difference between those that were prepared and those that were not, because they were all asleep. Every last one of them were asleep. What's the difference? And what does it mean? And get it right down to the point where, what do I need to do to be prepared so that I'm there when the door is open, not on the outside looking in when that door gets shut. Because if you remember, did a verse last week where Jesus was telling them, yeah, you know what, guys? Some of you did all these things in my name, prophesied and healed, but I tell you, I don't know you. So, tell me what you think. Give you a couple minutes to talk about it, if you will. Sure? Bob?
For me, the oil complete Christ for us is a light. When we accepted Jesus Christ, he pulled us out of a dark spot, he pulled us out of the grave, which is a dark place. And with the oil represents, for me, it represents that light. We need to be with that relationship with him. He needs to be the most important thing in our lives. That light that he gives us, we need to continue to shine. So that drop, when he's talking about those drops of oil, those are what sustain, like the blood. Blood sustains us, and we need to continue to do those things that he calls us to do. We need to continue to be that light. And the ones that don't have that oil, they knew in the beginning that he was the light, but he's not the most important thing in their lives. They're more important than the world, and things in the world are more important to them than what Christ is. And they don't have that oil.
Thank you. Anyone else? I would encourage you to know what it is. Because there are several things I want you to think about with this parable. It's a tough one. Remember, I did those that are best understood and those that are tough. This is a really, really tough one. Because when that door gets shut, those 5 bridesmaids, and by the way, please don't read into it, 50% are going in and 50% aren't. I don't think that's what Jesus was talking about at all. But what do I know? I don't think he, we can look at it so many different ways. But let's not forget what Jesus said right at the end. Because like I said, I love it when he does a little bit with it. He says, here's what I want you to know. Here is my theme. Here is the thing for you to take with you. But again, what are we talking about? Everyone was asleep. Does it mean we should never be asleep? I think that's part of what Jesus is saying, but there's something else. What determines? Because if you remember in Revelation, there's another door. John, talking about in Revelation, remember? He talks about Jesus. And I think most of us know that verse by heart. Behold, I stand at the door and what? And what's the rest of it? Oh, I would really encourage you to know that verse by heart. Behold, I stand at the door and I'm knocking. What is it that Jesus says to let you in? Behold, I stand at that door and I knock. And when you're knocking, isn't that a little bit like pleading? Please, I want you to be in here with me. Anyone else want to comment? And again, I just want you to say, it's not that I agree or disagree with that. Sometimes I take a look, I'm not trying to be critical. I just am not. But those drops of oil reeks to me of works righteousness, and I have a hard time with that. But, I'm not sure what to do with all of that, to be honest with you. But how come 5 got in and 5 did not? Was it because they were late? Was it because they didn't have what they needed to have at the time when the door was shut? What's going on? Here's some things I'd like you to think about. You know me, I don't have a lot of answers. But again, this very, very precious faith that we have, I want you to think about it. And then rest assured that we will be one of those walking in before that door is eternally shut. And I don't want to go into scaring you or scaring myself, but it gives me great pause. Remember, I talked about one of the scariest sounds was the rack of a 12-gauge shotgun? I think for a Christian, it would be the door being slammed shut. And we're on the outside. Here's some things that I'd like you to think about. Dodie, go ahead. Keep going. Who's the bridegroom? Because notice, at least in my mind, reading through this passage, the father bridegroom didn't come out. The bridegroom came out. He's the one that wouldn't let anybody in after the appointed time. Keep going. Who do the bridesmaids represent? Is it us, or were they just 10 bridesmaids? Keep going. Yeah, and that door was shut. And for sometimes, I think with the modern gospel, so to speak, where it's sometimes the prosperity gospel, and it's not here, by the way. We are, as a congregation, we are so fortunate to have Bob, and he never does that, ever. I've never heard him preach on the prosperity gospel. I've never heard him water it down. But sometimes, if you're reading articles like I do, and if you're listening to others like I do, gosh, it's hard not to be bombarded with, well, God's a loving God. He'll make sure that nobody goes to hell, which I think, if I may guess, I think that's what God wants, is for nobody to go to hell. But we forget about God and his justice. He's laid it out. There is a hell. So the door was shut. Keep going. Yeah, who was at the door? Key. And then, let's keep going. I want you to take a look at this verse. But of that exact day and hour, no one knows, not even angels of heaven, nor the Son. In his humanity. I love the Amplified Version puts that. But only the Father. Nobody knows. So how can we be prepared on constant watch if we don't know? I know generation after generation, as I read about it, have all thought the second coming of Christ would be in their time. And it did not happen. It could happen in the next 5 minutes. It might not happen for 5,000 years. But we are to be prepared. Okay, let's keep going. So be on alert. This is from the previous chapter. Remember, we're in Matthew 25. I want you to see some of the things Jesus is talking to his disciples only about. Be on alert, give strict attention, be cautious and active in faith. Notice what it says. Be active in faith. That means if you are active in faith, what does that mean? Active in faith. If you're unsure, read James. James will tell you. For you don't know which day, whether near or far, your Lord is coming. But understand this, if the head of the house had known what time of the night the thief was coming, he would have been on the alert and would not have allowed his house to be broken into. Therefore, you who follow me must also be ready, because the Son of Man is coming at an hour when you don't expect him. In this pandemic, in this time of all this election stuff, and I'm not talking about it, by the way, I have seen despair, absolute despair in people. And people, even to the point where they say, just come take me now, Lord, just come take me now. We don't know. But it does warn us to be active in our faith. Do I have one more? Yeah. Going to Luke. You too, be continually ready, because the Son of Man is coming at an hour that you do not expect. It's not once he tells people. It's several times. You don't know. In fact, he says, I don't know. Even the angels in heaven don't know. And I won't even go there as to trying to get into God's mind. What are you waiting for? And, what determines when you pull that plug? I don't even want to get into God's mind. What I do know is Jesus says, be ready. Be prepared. And I do not want to be on the outside looking in. Because I can get up here and my head knowledge can help all of you out. I can be in this church week after week after week and do all of these things. And Jesus can look at me and say, I never knew you. But I'm going to tell you right now, I personally believe that I have a personal relationship with Christ. I am not afraid of this at all. I am not afraid. Because of that personal relationship with Christ. And yes, you're going to get a little bit of Gary Watterson here because I have the Spirit within me, which I think is one of those great dividers, those that do and those that don't. I have been assured that I will be walking through that door. But to be active in my faith, I need to tell you and others the very same. May we pray? Oh Lord, you give us just so much to think about. And we try so hard to put it in perspective. What is it, especially for someone like me who's a head person, and so hard to get into this heart of mine. But we know, Lord, that this personal relationship that we have with you is such a key. But now that we have it, help us to be active in our faith. Amen. Thank you for coming.